Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much, Alessandro and Teresa, for inviting me here to stay with you for these couple of days and exchange ideas about different topics. As John has said, the topic of today is the connection between punishment and authoritarianism. And I will take you down south because we will explore things connected with present time and recent past in Latin America, mostly in Argentina. But I think that the topic that I selected for presenting today has a lot of resonance, a lot of echoes here, particularly in Northern Ireland, but more generally in the contemporary world that we are living. So I guess that we could find these connections and can chat a bit later on them. I will try to put my presentation. This one. So I would like to start with these photographs. These are three photographs that were taken last year around February and March 2024 in the province of Santa Fe in Argentina, where I live and work, are all photos taken inside prisons. As you can see there are many people that are in positions of humiliation and subjugation by prison officials that looks more similar to military officials in their appearance. These are not photographs that were produced by a critical journalist or that were in some way discovered by NGOs connected with human rights protection. These were photographs that were publicized by the governor of my province, by his Ministry of Safety throughout their social networks. Then I would like to read this briefly. This is a summary of a complaint submitted by the Public Criminal Defense Service to the Specialized Prosecutor for Institutional Violence in my province about something that has taken place on March 2, 2024 in the wings 7 and 8 of the prison number 11 of that province. During a search, all the people detained in these two areas, 158 detainees, were subjected to repeated blows, punches, and kicks of various kinds by the prison officials, although only one group of only 15 people reported it because of the widespread fear of reprisal by the prison staff. Some of them said that towels were placed over their heads while water was poured over them to drown them. Others had plastic bags placed on their heads and tightened for the same purpose. Others said they were beaten on the soles of their feet with truncheons. One detainee said he had been given electric shocks. Several of the detainees reported sexually aggressive actions by the guards, including one case of impalement. One detainee had urine poured over him. Another detainee had his head placed in the puddle on the ground to drown him. The prisoners were examined by a forensic doctor from the judicial branch of the province, an official forensic doctor, who found numerous injuries of the bodies of the complainants that were consistent with the description they were doing to the public defense officials. So I will go back to this description many times during my talk today and to the photographs. This is my starting point because it's this case of what I will label as massive torture that has occurred in 48 hours in these two wings have taken part of my time during the last year trying to do different kind of things in order to produce first knowledge about what has happened and also to make responsible the people who were involved. Punishment and society studies in the last 40 years have placed at the center of the research agenda the question of penal change. This has implied in some way to neglect inertia, persistence, continuity in the penal field. Some works has attempted to reverse this in recent years. So my presentation today is a planned article that tries to contribute to the problematization of what I will label as penal persistence, but from the global peripheries and exploring a Latin American context. I will discuss the presence of authoritarianism in contemporary penal field, its characteristics, conditions, and effects. And my starting point is this case of massive tortures. In the description that I rapidly read, and probably not so well in English, there were some torture techniques that have already names in Argentina and some of them more generally in Latin America, in Spanish. Picañar, given electric shocks. Submarino seco, the plastic bag around the head. Pata pata, the using the truncheon to punch the feet of the sole of the feet of the people. All names for torture techniques with a long history in this country that were developed by military officials, police officials, prison officials during the whole 20th century in many different occasions. So my main question is what makes these practices of torture possible in Argentine prisons today? And I will try to present conditions and dynamics that came from inside the prison world and conditions and dynamics that came from outside the prison world that I think are complexly intertwined, and both are linked to authoritarianism as I will label as a governmental rationality. I think that exploring this link between authoritarianism and punishment makes a lot of sense, not only in the Argentinian case, in many other contexts of Latin America, but also in other regions of the world, in the contemporary world. So I will start with a brief comments on authoritarianism as a governmental rationality. So my starting point here is a debate that has taken place, particularly in English-speaking countries since the 1990s, in rereading the work of Michel Foucault, particularly the last Foucault. That's why I used the expression governmental rationality. In that debate, already in the 1990s, many authors, and I have learned that Mariana Valverde was here some months ago. So Mariana was one of the contributors in this direction. She wrote a fantastic paper in 1996 about the possibilities of despotism inside liberal governmental rationality. In that debate, there was this discussion about the possibility of generating in different kinds of governance practices an intersection and hybridization between governmental rationalities. Already there, some authors adventured in trying to think about authoritarianism as a governmental rationality that is not outside the liberal world, that could be inside the liberal world, and could be thought as a rationality that imagines the subject to be governed as incapable of governing itself as a free and rational being, and therefore as someone to be coerced, neutralized, or even eliminated. This governmental rationality installs a principle that goes beyond the idea of a limited or frugal government, an idea that we can connect with liberal rationalities of government, and justify a maximum degree of intervention by governmental authorities, including the use of force against the governed and to the extreme in order to produce obedience. Authoritarianism as a governmental rationality runs throughout the history of Argentina and more generally Latin America. And of course, there were moments in which the diffusion of authoritarianism was strongly connected with the construction of dictatorial regimes. Argentina has experienced between 1930 and 1983, so in half a century, 26 years of dictatorial regimes, so a very heavy presence of dictatorial regimes during the 20th century. But it's also connected with what some decolonial social theories coming from Latin America have labeled a colonial matrix of power. This idea that we can exercise power without limits over the body and the soul of somebody needs, in some way, one background of production and reproduction of class and racial hierarchies in an extreme level that has been constructed first and foremost during colonial times in Latin America, but has been present in metamorphosed ways in our present. So I think that in order to understand this contemporary presence of rationalities and practices that we can label as authoritarian in the penal field, we have to look at some dynamics and conditions that came from inside the prison world. As I already said, then I will move to the outside of the prison world to understand other conditions and dynamics that are complexly intertwined with these ones. Prison services in Argentina, and I use the plural because Argentina is a federal state, so we have 23 provincial prison services and one federal prison service, so it's a really complex landscape in terms of prison services and more generally prison policies. Prison services were born in the second half of the 20th century and always in the context of military dictatorships with only one exception. So, for example, the prison service of Santa Fe province, where the photographs and the event that I presented at the beginning of my talk came from, was created in 1968, but other very important prison services like the Buenos Aires province prison service. Buenos Aires province is the biggest province in the country, and it has today 50,000 inmates, so it's the biggest prison service, was created in 1971, also in the same military dictatorship. Previously, prison officials have had a strong link with police institutions. They were police officials. Those working outside the prisons, producing some sort of activities connected with security, but even those who were working inside the prisons, producing different kind of activities connected with treatment, were all police officials. And this, in fact, is something that continues to exist in some provinces in Argentina, like Neuquén or Chubut, that are provinces in the Patagonia, in the far south of the country. Police institutions have had, since their birth, a strong level of militarization, a very high level of militarization. This was translated in many organizational, normative, and cultural traits of these police forces, and particularly in the grammar of the political enemy. Police forces in Latin America in general, and in Argentina in particular, have had a long history of being police in the service of the state, fighting the enemies of the state. These enemies have had, of course, different phases throughout history. In the 19th century, these enemies were socialist, anarchist, and communist. But during the 20th century, there were many other figures that also enter into this image of the political enemy, and also have had a very strong influence of positivist criminology. That is one thing that really fascinates me. So if you are interested, we can go back to this in the Q&A. The prisons, police institutions have had a strong connection with positivist criminology and with the grammar of the social enemy that positivist criminology, at least in some of their versions, have created during the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. In some way, these two grammars, the grammars of the political enemy and the social enemy, were connected inside the prison services to two figures, the political prisoner and the ordinary prisoner. Two figures that have been together inside prison spaces in Argentina during the entire 20th century and until the transition to democracy, and have had very strong connections, but also very strong differences in different moments. I would rather say that prison services that were strongly militarized have had a strong tradition of marginalizing the law. Prisons were constructed in Argentina as zones without law, and we are doing this talk in a school of law. That's very interesting. So law has always been characterized in its relation to prison by its vagueness and ambiguity, and this is not only the case in Argentina. It could be said in many other places of the world, and this has been translated in prison services in Argentina in a high degree of informality on prison governance. So prison authorities, prison officials take decisions with a huge level of discretion that opens, of course, the window to arbitrariness. And this is connected with a traditional absence or weakness of state mechanisms to oversee or monitor prison practices. These have been taken to the paroxysmal level, to the extreme level during the last military dictatorship in 1973, between 1973 and 1983, and the massification of state crimes. Prison spaces were very important in the circuit of what we label in Argentina as state terrorism. So transitions to democracy transition to democracy in Argentina since the 1980s has been characterized by attempts to democratize police institutions, particularly. There were many attempts. Again, we are a federal country, also in relation to police forces. So we have 27 different police forces. These different attempts of reform has been produced in the different jurisdictions in different moments with different scopes. But in general, they have been always been replied by attempts to counter reform. So in that way, the outcomes of this process of reform or attempts to produce democratization of police forces are quite limited. But in the case of the prison services, there were no attempts at all. So this is a very important element. Prison services has not even the object of attempts to reform in the name of democracy, the organization, normative culture, and practices. There are only a couple of specific measures every now and then in the last 40 years that we can read as attempts to democratize prison services. And there is only one exception of a structural attempt to reform the prison service in these last 40 years. And this exception has taken place precisely in the province of Santa Fe. So in the province of Santa Fe, where these photographs were taken and where this event of massive torture has happened. This has been translated in the last 40 years in the autonomy of prison services from elected authorities. In fact, prison services, prison authorities have a lot of influence in prison policy making by the elected politicians that reinforce the traditional features of these state institutions. And it has been translated in many authoritarian features on the culture of frontline prison officers. I don't have time to go in deep to this, but we have been doing in the last 20 years a lot of, not a lot, but some research with prison officials, both qualitative and quantitative, and we have many results that confirm the presence of these. These were a couple of examples, but I will jump them because I think I will not have enough time to go through everything that I plan. But just to give small example, in a survey we did in 2011 in the same province, in the province of Santa Fe, with a representative sample of prison officials of the entire province, 36% of them in 2011, the transition to democracy started in 1983, have been in agreement with the statement that a military type regime is the best way to run a prison. And this has been also translated more recently in the same province in another survey we did with only female prison officials. That is very interesting for many authors in different parts of the world. The multiplication of female prison officials inside prison services is a source of change towards some, let's say, a less punitive occupational culture. But when we asked this question in 2023, let's say 12 years later in the same province, but only to female officers, 24% of them agree with the statement that the military type regime is the best way to run a prison. This has been translated in the diffusion of authoritarian control practices by authorities and guards from the transition to democracy onwards, and has produced a very interesting development that I am doing quite a lot of research on this in the last couple of years, so we can also talk more about it in the Q&A. That is the creation of state mechanisms of external control over prison life as a response, since there were not a lot of reforms inside prison services, and the continuity of authoritarian control practices by prison authorities and guards were quite widespread. The response by many different actors was to create mechanisms of external oversight or control of what happens inside prisons. This has also an uneven development in the different jurisdictions in Argentina, but there were some in which it has been translated in quite impressive landscape today. So, for example, at the federal level, we have 12,000 federal prisoners today in the country. We have 3 state institutions that do practices of oversight of conditions of detention, of practices inside spaces of detention at the federal level. We have an entire ombudsman-style organization that defends the rights of the prisoners, that today have 350 public employees. So it's a big body that do a lot of things in terms of inspection, producing recommendations, reports. We also have a National Committee for the Prevention of Torture, connected with the OPCAT, connected with the United Nations Convention Against Torture. And we have also a public defense office that have created a set of practices of control of life inside prison, including also inspections, reports, and recommendations. What is interesting of these state practices, because all of these are state institutions, is that they have, at least since the end of the 2000s, they have included in their repertoire of actions judicial litigation. And so there are many cases that are taken by the lawyers of these different institutions, and some have produced very interesting outcomes. I could go back to this in the Q&A. So there was some sort of also paradox during these years, and this is not only at the federal level, but also at many provincial penitentiary systems, that there was an increased openness of the prison to external actors. So 34 of our public universities, we have 70 public universities in the country, 34 have programs that do things inside prisons with prisoners, with unmediated contact, without supervision by prison officials, in different kind of rooms, centers, whatever. So I am the director of one program in my own university. So we have 120 prisoners who study undergraduate programs inside the university. We have 3 centers in 2 male prisons and 1 female prison. And all day long, there are people coming from the university inside these prisons and have direct contact with these prisoners who are studying different things inside the university. But also, there is an important amount of social organizations doing things inside prisons with prisoners. And some of these organizations are even, quite critical of the prison service. I am not saying that all of them are. So we have feminist organizations doing things inside women prisons, or we have even anti-carceral organizations doing things inside prisons. So there is a constant challenge and contestation of institutional violence inside prisons by various external actors, judicial, political, and social, and by prisoners themselves. We have a long history of resistance by prisoners, including the cooperation with some of these external actors, particularly with the oversight mechanisms, and particularly in connection with judicial litigation. But also, we have a long history of collective organization with ups and downs, like here in the UK. Collective organizations of prisoners is not something that it's in good health everywhere at all. But we have some experiences that are quite interesting recently, particularly the creation of a union of prisoners workers that have been active since 2012 in the Federal Prison Service. So that implies that there has been a constant effort and actions of prison authorities and guards to maintain authoritarian control practices. It's not that these authoritarian control practices are sustained only because initial conditions would automatically and directly generate these kind of effects of preventing change. And I could give you many examples of this. One of my favorite examples is when this only unique attempt to produce a structural reform of a prison service in my province around between 2008 and 2011, these political actors of a progressive orientation, they said, well, we need to change the law that regulates the prison service because the law was created by a military dictatorship, was not a law of democracy. So we need to reform this. The law was of 1978. So they created a commission, a technical commission, to rewrite the law. I was part of it, so I know everything firsthand. And after the second meeting of this technical commission, there was the first and most important public demonstration by prison officials in this history of the country. So 700 prison officials in uniform went to the main square and they do a protest in front of the House of Government against this prison policy. As you can imagine, the technical commission was dismantled in the next couple of weeks, and this idea of transforming radically the law regulating the prison service disappears. So there are constantly struggles around institutional violence in prison contexts. I like a metaphor of an old student and friend, Vitor Dieter, who said, well, there is some sort of tug of war, I think that you can say it in English, constantly in action in relation to institutional violence. That's why in some moments and in some places, institutional violence could have different kind of extensions and intensity over these last 40 years. And also the modalities of institutional violence could change in relation to this constant struggle by different kind of actors, both prisoners and external actors. In times and places where the strength of the actors who carry out initiatives to contest and challenge institutional violence is greater, it becomes less widespread and less intense, and in modalities less obvious. And there is a very interesting anecdote when this ombuds type body at the federal level presented in 2008 a very interesting report. The title was Cuerpos Castigados, Bodies Punished, about the prevalence of torture inside the federal prisons. There was a huge public and political scandal. But after that huge public and political scandal, in which the reaction of the political and prison authorities was a reaction of denial, there were a subsequent strengthening of mechanisms of oversight inside federal prisons, and in some of them there was even a stronger openness of the prison to external actors, particularly to universities and social organizations. So since the beginning of the 2010s, there was a decrease in direct institutional violence officially recorded by the PPN, is the name of this ombuds type body. And this is a view shared also by many prisoners inside federal prisons. One student of mine have finished a very interesting ethnographic study inside one federal prison in the city of Buenos Aires. It's a male prison. It's the first long-term ethnography of prison life inside federal prisons in Argentina. And he has talked a lot with prisoners about this that confirm in some way this view. This has implied in many occasions, as I already said, changing the modalities of institutional violence. So for example, the welcome, as they call it, in the prison services in Argentina, that means a very violent reception of the new inmate by prison officials, has been in some way abolished inside prison services, but in some occasions it has been transformed in a welcome or reception, violent welcome or reception by prisoners that in agreement with prison officials and authorities do this. So there is an interesting debate now, not only in Argentina, but in other places of Latin America, about the outsourcing of the use of violence by prison authorities and guards into hands of certain prisoners in the framework of corrupt exchange schemes. However, there are still a lot of evidences of the persistence of direct institutional violence. I also jumped this. These are two new surveys that we did in two different provinces that you have to believe me because I will jump it, but there are two small provinces, one in the north of the country, in the northwest, and the other one in the northeast, where we were able to do a survey with inmates in 2023 and 2024, and the results in relation to the presence of direct institutional violence by prison officials is quite clear. So going back to the description of the event we referred to at the beginning of this presentation, probably we are witnessing a new mutation of institutional violence in the opposite direction that we have witnessing in the last few years, towards outsourcing and more covert forms of institutional violence and with less intensity. Because as we have seen in the brief description, this was of course a more cruel, widespread, open form. So are we witnessing some sort of return of the repressed in this example? So in order to understand this better, we need to also take into consideration some dynamics that came from the outside. This is a very simple graph of incarceration rate in the country since the 1980s, so to 2023. As you can see, we don't have data for a whole period of 10 years in the country. We have data for some prison services, but not for the entire country. But at the end of the military dictatorship, the incarceration rate was around 68 to 90 prisoners per 100,000 inhabitants. Of course, we are not counting there the unofficial detains by the military dictatorship. We are only counting, the legally detained inside prison spaces. But as you can see, there was a huge growth of incarceration rates in the country, particularly between the mid-1990s and the mid-2000s, and then again since 2013 and 14 till today. So now we have 240 prisoners per 100,000 inhabitants. In 1992, we have only 62. In 1992, the incarceration rate of Argentina was lower than the incarceration rate of Sweden. So, of course, living conditions inside prisons in Argentina were much worse than the ones in Sweden in that moment, but the extension of the use of punishment was quite limited. So transition to democracy was in some way connected to penal moderations in the 1990s and the first half of 1990s. This was connected also with the diffusion of human rights language, the idea of the rule of law, and many legal changes that were translated in a more moderate use of incarceration. This began to change in the 1990s, at the beginning of the 1990s, first with the emergence of the language of mano dura, hard hand, punitive language inside politics and in public and political debate, but with a limited scope associated with the war on drugs and very connected with the influence of the US government, as in many other Latin American cases during the 1990s. But it was in some way encapsulated in relation to offenses connected with illegal drugs. This has changed in the second half of the 1990s after the effects, devastating effects of neoliberal reforms in the country that were strongly promoted at the beginning of the 1990s. Argentina was one of the cases in Latin America in which neoliberal reforms were produced very radically and very rapidly. So in only 5 or 6 years, the entire relationship between state and economy has changed dramatically. And this has produced devastating economic effects in terms of poverty, unemployment, inequality, and also a crisis of insecurity, this concept that is very important in public and political debate in Argentina since then. So crime was at the center of the political and public debate, and the language of mano dura became more widespread across political parties. There was built a political consensus in the electoral competition, and this has produced what I have labeled as a punitive populist wave from above, from the elites, clearly, strongly promoted. I don't have time to show you how, by the elites. And it has been translated in the first growth of the incarceration rate. At the end of the 1990s and the beginning of 2000s, we experienced one of the most dramatic economic crises in our history, and probably one of the most dramatic economic crises in the entire Latin America history in the last 100 years, that has produced very, very important and dramatic effects, but also it has produced a wave of punitive populism from below, in which there was a strong social mobilization around street crime with the figure of the victim that has produced many legal and policy changes and the growth of incarceration. So in that way, between this punitive populism from above and this punitive populism from below, during the 1990s, the second half of the 1990s and the first half of the 2000s, we have witnessed this growth of incarceration rate, 100% of growth in only 10 years. But in 2003, a new government was elected that in some way proclaimed the need to break with the neoliberal past. And this is part of a wave of political alliances and programs in Latin America. We can also talk more about it because I have done a lot of research on this that has been taking place in other countries, Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay for a while. In the case of Argentina, these post-neoliberal governments, as we label, and of course it's an imperfect label, but we don't have another one, so we use it for that reason, has produced many interesting changes in terms of economic and social policy, and in some moment has produced a momentary reversal of the punitive term in Argentina, but at the end of this process between 2003 and 2015, particularly moments of political weakness of this governmental alliance, we have seen the temptation of punitive populism re-emerge and has produced a more ambivalent penal policy during this period. After that, we have experienced since 2015 till 2019 the return of a new right government. A new right government that has had very common characteristics with the experience of the 1990s in Argentina. So they have reproduced punitive populism from above, now selecting two targets, narcos and migrants, and producing some legal changes, particularly around prison life. They have cut many possibilities of early release and parole for many people, and they have also in that way increased incarceration rate. But since 2023, we are experiencing a really new kind of thing in a way. Of course, continuities with the past are many, but this ultra-right governmental alliance led by President Milei have produced extreme versions of this old combination between neoliberalism and neoconservatism. So there is now a reloaded rhetoric of mano dura with many legal changes initiative that has not been produced so far because the government do not have a majority in the National Congress, that goes from lowering the age of criminal responsibility to authorizing the military to fight crime. This last proposal is really an important one, symbolically speaking. Argentina is one of the few countries in Latin America that after the transition to democracy have by law forbidden the use of military officials to fight against crime. And for us, it's one of the key commitments of the transition to democracy, a way of trying to not return to the past. So this change that is proposed by this new government is really of a crucial symbolical importance. But they have been producing policy initiatives like an exacerbated version of criminalization and repression of social protest, or a new regime of restriction for highly dangerous federal prisoners. So there are a lot of continuities and discontinuities, but in a context that could be read, as many have been doing in the last years in many different contexts of the world, as a right against rights, because it has been connected strongly with an attack to main ideas of the political system in Argentina, like the idea of social justice, or the idea that where there is a need, there is a right. This government is saying that social justice is something that we have to, and they are saying it very clearly and in a loud voice, that we have to escape from it, that the idea of the presence of the state is a metaphor that we use a lot in order to try to fight against exclusion and inequality. So the idea of this government is to produce a state that is not present in fighting against exclusion and inequality. So the idea of a radical neoliberal version of public policy. So we are witnessing, and I have been reading quite a lot, again, Stuart Hall and his work with colleagues here in the UK at the end of the 1970s and the beginning of the 1980s. We are witnessing clearly a version of authoritarian populism that goes in some way beyond the previous punitive populism that we have been witnessing. The case of Santa Fe province, and I am trying to go faster, the case of Santa Fe province is quite interesting because it has experienced a huge increase, as you can see, of the incarceration rate, particularly in the last 10 years, very clearly in the last 10 years. We have two lines there because we have a lot of prisoners inside police spaces, not inside prisons. So if you consider the incarceration rate without them, is, as you can see, the orange line is the line that really counts, is the real one, considering all the people that have been detained. But in this case, the new governmental alliance at the provincial level that started in December 2023 has, in some way, produced exactly the same reloaded rhetoric of mano dura, but with political strength in the legislative power, in the provincial legislature. And they have produced huge, important levels of changes. They have enacted a new prison law, and they have enacted a new prison service law. The law that we wanted to change throughout these 40 years has been changed now. Both have been changed in 3 weeks between 10 December and 21 of December without any kind of parliamentary discussion, without any kind of commission, without any kind of voices of prisoners, ex-prisoners, social organizations, public universities that do things inside prisons. And they have produced, of course, a reform that is exactly a nightmare for everybody who has been fighting against those traditional traits of prison services, because they have, in some way, reinforced them in a very clear way. So, I don't know, collective petitions today by prisoners are a serious disciplinary offense in this province. They limited the judicial control of prison life. They regulated something that they call penitentiary intelligence. So now prison service could hear the talks of visitors with prisoners without any kind of judicial order and without any kind of judicial supervision. So they can hear everybody. They can hear me when I go to the university center to talk with our students. So they are not doing it, but they could. They regulated work against as a duty, not as a right. So they have done really incredible things. And this has been translated in policy changes. Less permeability, more restrictions to prisoners. They have used what they name high-profile prisoners as a central figure, but these restrictions spill over other prisoners. So we have 600 high-profile prisoners and other 9,500 prisoners that are not high-profile, but they are experiencing many of the same restrictions of the high-profile prisoners. The humiliating official videos and photos of prisoners, I couldn't show you the videos because I am very bad at this kind of things of using technology, but they do not only spread through social networks these photographs, they spread also videos of these actions. And they are strongly connected with the aesthetic of the prison policy of President Bukele in El Salvador. That is why we are talking in many different places of Latin America today about Bukelization. The aesthetic is exactly the same. They are trying to copy it. And in fact, the governor and the Ministry of Safety and Security have produced many public statements in some way saying that Bukele is the way that we have to follow. That is a very interesting thing if we think about it, because for the first time, many of these political authorities are thinking of copying not the global north, but another context of the global south. Unfortunately, it's the one that really scares you a lot. So I will jump to the conclusions. So the persistence of these authoritarian practices in contemporary Argentine prisons are, of course, difficult to understand. I have been discussing this recent literature on penal persistence. So Ashley Rubin, in a very interesting work, has used the metaphor of a penal layer. There was, in her view, usually in the penal realm, and this is not only in Argentina, in the UK or in the US. The US is the case she has been studying a lot. Accumulation, rather substitution of different layers, even if the later layer take precedence over the earlier ones. So the longevity of authoritarian practices in Argentine prison could be considered, using Rubin's perspective, an indicator of the depth of the penal layer in which they were created, just as their proliferation throughout the prison field is an evidence of what Ashley named thickness of these penal layers. She said that at some moments, some places, penal layer may be compressed, submerged, even confined to tunnels or reservoirs, but this doesn't prevent them from rebounding at another juncture. So this makes me think a lot about this return of the repressed. There is a very interesting discussion about feedback effects in contemporary literature on punishment and society in connection with the political science literature on path dependence. And And one is tempted to use it in order to think about the persistence of authoritarian practice in Argentine prisons. But we have to be very careful, because it's not enough to simply point out the existence of initial conditions, authoritarian regimes, the diffusion in the past of authoritarian ideas and practices in prison services, that will have long-lasting effect. There is a need for a more dynamic way of thinking about what persists, which gives centrality to the agency of the actors involved in penal institutions and practices. The actors who wish to support their continuity strive to do so in the face of those who challenge them in a constant struggle. It's not just an initial condition that creates a path that we could not escape. It's that people is continuously fighting for persistence. These prison authorities, these guards, these political authorities. So the appearance of continuity can mask the fact that there are sometimes changes beneath the surface. Tellen, an author coming from path dependence literature, says there is a partial renegotiation of some elements of an institution while leaving others in place. So institutional innovation and institutional reproduction are combined. There is no a zero-sum game between innovation and reproduction. A very interesting paper by Phil Goodman and Kate Quinns have introduced the idea of palimpsest in order to think about it, the metaphor of palimpsest, in order to think that change and continuity, are deeply intertwined and mutually informing processes. I love that metaphor, but I prefer to use another one, that is the concept of metamorphosis as a dialectic of the same and the different. It came from the work of a very interesting French author who have worked in the 70s a lot on asylums and mental health policies, Robert Castel. He said the past doesn't repeat itself in the present, but the present plays and innovates using the legacy of the past. So what exists in a given time and place is not exactly the same as it was when it emerged, but it's not entirely different. This is indeed what has effectively happened with institutional violence in Argentine prison from the transition to democracy until today. The return of the repressed, revealed by the case with which I began the presentation, has revealed, that has invited, in a way, very pessimistic views about the future. So I remembered a very interesting article that I read many, many years ago by a fantastic author, Pat O'Malley, in which he wrote about against criminologies of catastrophes. Of course, today it's very difficult to be, outside a catastrophic view of our future. But just to finish with an optimistic tone, it's not the case that the relatively limited number of actors who challenge and fight against practices of institutional violence do not longer have any kind of impact on the prison field. Prison continues to be a field of struggle and conflict. And in fact, in the case with which I started, there are many actions produced by different actors who have been very important first in order that we could know about this case of massive torture, but then about producing some political effects. So the Public Defense Office, when they did an inspection of the wings, they interviewed a lot of prisoners, they did the report, they produced the complaint to the prosecutor of institutional violence, specialized in institutional violence. They have been pressing that prosecutor a lot during the next months. We, people coming from outside the oversight bodies, like people working inside public universities or social organizations, pressed a lot in order to get the National Committee for the Prevention of Torture to visit the province, go exactly to the same prison, interview exactly the same prisoners, and they did a report, a very critical report to the provincial government. The specialized prosecutor of institutional violence indicted 8 prison officials. She didn't indict them for torture. She indicted them for ill treatment. It's an offense with a lower punishment. And of course, we are not happy about it. But these prison officials are indicted. It's the first time that prison officials in the province have been indicted. And the provincial government stopped publishing humiliating photos and videos of prisoners as part of the communication policy. Of course, this is not a triumph, not a victory, but it's just an example of how the struggles goes on. Thank you very much.